Today's episode is brought to you by Modern Grower. Modern Grower is the go-to source for 100% organic, GMO-free microgreen seeds. Trusted by hundreds of growers for high quality and low prices. If you're growing microgreens, start saving at shop.moderngrower.co.
In terms of dipping into that carbon jar and using up some of that carbon, no-till is talked about as a way to stop that and slow that down. But no-till is kind of this umbrella. It's a sliding scale in terms of what that is. And some people, they get really nuanced in terms of, literally nothing to some people, vertical tillage might count as no-till. Where does tillage become a problem? Is it depth? Is it a certain amount? Where if we are in a human system, right? Like we need a certain amount of production. We have to be able to manage these things. Certain things can't happen using kind of idealistic systems. Is there an amount of tillage that's kind of within that no-till regime that is probably okay? But if you start really going beyond that, that's when major damage starts to happen?
Yes, very good point. One thing that I like the audience to the listener to understand. You use the word we use carbon. It's more we lose carbon, because plants don't use carbon from the soil. We lose it in terms of basically CO2 as a mechanism of respiration. We accumulate carbon in the soil by bringing it in, and we lose it from CO2 emitted. So roots don't use carbon. They put carbon into the soil, and the microbes eat on that. And at some point, if we still have time, and it's important to explain the level of the different components of carbon. Why is it different? The sugar, the lignin, and cellulose, and so on. Cellulose. So yes, the tillage is tricky. There is mechanisms that should be avoided, which what we call inversion tillage, flipping the whole layer, moldboard plow, the old plowing. What does plowing do? Negative effects. Basically creates a tillage pan, basically a constipation, like a restricting layer by pushing, and you will have this to have a much lower conductivity of water. So the layer is much more compacted. Okay, so this clay pan or tillage pan. And then you flip it. What are you bringing the most active, everything living large and accumulating. You bring it upside down, you put it to the oxygen. So gets basically immediately lost everything that you had. So tillage, unfortunately, has this difficult thing, which, again, we cannot judge. It depends on the goal. It's almost, objective function is, but I need, how are you going to grow potato if you don't till? Right? And we like potatoes. Yeah, of course we like potatoes. So can we mitigate that component of doing that? Where do we grow potatoes? We tend to grow potatoes in sandy soils where there is much less structure to start with. So one thing about me is that I'm above the parts in describing this system. So no one can be offended if I say, tillage, you do one tillage, you lose pretty much a lot of what you have already accumulated because you just play. When you do the surface, and like you said, you scrape the surface, you do a little bit of that. If it is non-inversion tillage, it is sometimes necessary, for example, in all the organic system where you basically pull the weeds. There are so many studies comparing, is that scraping the surface to remove that weed, and the weed being on the soil that brings carbon, better than spraying it with an herbicide that costs you an arm and a leg in carbon and energy to spray it where you do no tillage. And so a full no tillage is the ideal situation where basically rotations, you can still do no tillage in controlling the weeds by having cover crops, but there are difficult. You still have to dry them down. You have to kill them, and so you use chemical herbicide, and you're ready to a level of complexity that you don't belong already into a certified, kind of organic system. So back to your question: if you scrape that, what are you basically doing? You are losing that carbon that you accumulated, but only from that layer. You haven't touched this part. the part below that remains, the aggregate remain the same. Right. So when you touch it, it's open. You break the aggregates and carbon is emitted as a CO2 because the microbes can access the carbon available and it's a feast. If it is protected inside, they stay in there. It's not that they don't live. They eat and poop, and expel carbon in the aggregate. And the aggregates are much closer. So that glue keeps growing and becomes, if you scrape that in 5 centimeters, you want to get rid of the weeds, then the damage is for those. You change bulk density, you change that percent of carbon, and we can quantify exactly how much carbon you have emitted in the atmosphere. Versus flipping the whole marble plow, you mix the hell out of that, and then you lose a large amount. But again, potatoes have to be done this way, but there are lots of other novel techniques of being able to managing potatoes in a way that could accumulate more carbon.
Yeah, it's a longer rotation where your potatoes and then your cover crops for a few years build that carbon back up, and then
exactly, and you maintain. That's exactly right. No potatoes after potatoes, so you go back to you can have your hairy vetch and clover as cover crop right away. You have corn and soybeans, and you bring back to the system what you did. Then because we have to eat potatoes, there's no question on their bounties and value and fibers and all the positive aspect of that.
Farm Small, Farm Smart Daily is part of the Modern Grower Podcast Network. Check out some of our other shows like Carrot Cash Flow, the Growing Microgreens Podcast, and Farm Small, Farm Smart. Learn more about the shows using the link below.